You've mentioned that the AATROX rework was a success in terms of increasing popularity, retaining fantasy theme, but why was this a detriment to his core gameplay, and why was the approach different with Swain, which you explained as delivering poor fantasies and Oxy in general to conserve the gameplay expectation players have latched onto? Is it just a shrug sacrifice because of his previous low play rate? So there's a few things there. Let's first talk about Swain first. So one of the things is just like, is grand general gameplay, the great strategist, all that compelling in League of Legends? We start with that. You're like, well, hey, if Swain's fantasy is the great strategist, why don't you rework him to not be Swain and be the great strategist instead? There's a question first of, is that gameplay going to be compelling? Like, you know, some character who, say, like, opens a map and places armies on the board or whatever. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but just noting that, like, that's a very different fantasy that we have to, you know, then determine is compelling or not. And then another thing about Swain is, despite the fact that he's the Grand General, he's also Bird Demon. And so one of the things about Swain in terms of his rework, right, is we felt it was pretty essential theme-wise to retain Bird Demon. That seemed like a pretty cool part of this character, right? And so then once you've retained Bird Demon theme-wise, it starts being like, well, in a gameplay perspective, you should probably also retain Bird Demon. And so to compare that to AATROX, right, it's like when we reworked AATROX, we didn't remove his greatsword, right? We weren't like, oh, AATROX doesn't have a greatsword anymore. Instead, we like doubled down on his greatsword. And we said, oh, AATROX is a greatsword character. Let's find a way to make this greatsword feel more heavy and more like a greatsword than he had before, right? So I think that's a similar thing to Swain, where it's like Swain was like Bird Demon. Okay, he's still Bird Demon. And AATROX is like greatsword. Okay, he's still greatsword, even if, you know, some of the underlying gameplay changed in different ways. So that's the first thing to think about there. The other thing is, in terms of like the idea that like, okay, AATROX was the detriment of his core gameplay. That is true, but one of the things we always have to think about when we do like a giant VGU update to a character is how much of that core do we want to maintain and who is it serving? And so in AATROX's case, AATROX was one of the least popular champions in League of Legends for a very long time, similar to characters like Old Yorick and Old Nunu and Old Aurelion Soul, things like that. And so it was basically deemed that like AATROX's old gameplay, even if you liked it, because again, there's someone who likes really anything out there, right? So if you liked AATROX's old gameplay, like that's not wrong. You're not wrong for liking it. But it was kind of like deemed that like the minimum like it doesn't seem to be able to hold like a minimum like player base to like be worth maintaining in the game. And then on top of that, it was like, and we have this whole great sword fantasy on a character that we think we can deliver on there. And so while AATROX did move away from his old player base, he was moving away from a place where it just didn't really have that many people like interested in playing it. And so we felt like there was better ways to achieve an AATROX fantasy and open up that character's theme and interest. Whereas Swain, like, you know, when we changed Swain, we were improving his gameplay, but we still felt pretty strongly that's like, hey, well, we still want to do Bird Demon because Bird Demon's a pretty compelling, like, thematic and gameplay space for this character. And in Swain's case, that comes at a little bit of the cost of he's also a Grand General, right? There's a deal of this with the character LeBlanc, right? Like, who is LeBlanc? LeBlanc is the Deceiver, right? And then you play LeBlanc in League, and she has some deceptive qualities. Her passive, her W, right, when she blinks back. Like, she has some deceptive qualities, but I wouldn't say that if you, like, I wouldn't call LeBlanc's kit in League of Legends the Deceiver, like the ultimate version of a Deceiver, right? But it is a really cool kit that really fits LeBlanc. Like, it's a fun kit for her. And so changing her to be the ultimate Deceiver, it's like, it's something we could do, but it's the question of, like, you know, do we want to make that change versus what we already have? In LeBlanc's case, it's probably would be a bad idea to make that change, given like she has a pretty vibrant and player base who really enjoys her. Whereas in AATROX's case of like, okay, what about, you know, auto-attacky, stand there and auto-attacky man, we found that like AATROX, his old kit, just really didn't have that vibrant player base in the same way. So we went with a more like comprehensive rework for him to better deliver on like the great sword theme. And that's like a sacrifice for making that's like a sacrifice we're making with like many VGUs we do. This is like one of the downsides in quotes of VGUs is when you're making a VGU and you're massively changing your character, you're always going to make someone unhappy. Because there's always going to be someone who likes the character the way it is. There are people who loved old Nunu. There are people who loved old Scion. There are people who loved old Poppy, right? And when we change those characters, the people who loved the old characters, obviously they weren't being served anymore. Then like we changed them. And so that's one thing you're always thinking about in design is the trade-offs of what you're doing. And so when it comes to VGUs, we tend to believe that the benefit added of, you know, better delivering on a stronger thematic and gameplay fantasy for a character in these cases, like Scion, AATROX, Poppy, things like that, outweighs the cost of, you know, a certain number of players feeling like they you know, their character has changed. And like that's the bet we make is everything you do in design is going to have some sort of cost and some sort of benefit to it, and you have to weigh those against each other. Poposhi, thanks for the 16 months. Nice cat beanie. Yeah, a friend of mine got me this. It's very great. Very, very warm. Explain reasoning for removing the hold ping. I can't give you direct reasoning because I didn't work on that system, but I'll say that like the ping wheel benefits from like not having infinite pings on it. Like hyperbolic example, imagine the ping wheel had 36 different pings. Like that's maybe not the best experience both to cast pings and to tell to people. And so mainly it's a thing where it's like any ping that's in the game needs to hold its weight. It needs to be used and understood and useful. And some of the pings we put in the game in the past don't tend to like really be used or be super useful to players. And that's something we have to think about. So in regards to the hold ping, I have a feeling like it probably just went very underused and was not very useful in most cases, would be my guess. Note, have you considered adding back fun? Okay, there we go. It's my job as a game designer to detect fun and eviscerate it when found, actually. I actually get like a performance review every couple months, and the entire point of the performance review is how much fun did I destroy. I'll like come in, they'll be like, you know, this patch, you made 5 players cry, and that's really under target for you. And, you know, I'm like, okay, I'll get those numbers up. We're going to get that to 10 players next patch, 100%.